ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Hey there. Look, just before we get into today's episode, I wanted to let you know that Richard and I have announced a national tour. Conversations Live will be coming to a theatre in your capital city in August, and we would love to see you there. It's going to be a lot of fun. Tickets are on sale now. Just go to the Conversations website to find out more. It could be that had a circus come to Colm Toibin's little town in Ireland when he was growing up, he might have run away with them. And perhaps I wouldn't be speaking with a world-renowned writer today, but a ringmaster or lion tamer. Colm has always been open to where life might take him. He's found excitement in that kind of freedom. And from the sitting rooms of Enniscorthy to the pubs of Dublin, from the wild parties of post-Franco Barcelona to the suburban streets of LA, wherever Colm goes, he keeps a running list of tiny details, observations of seemingly mundane encounters, an offhand comment, or the cut of a lady's outfit on a train. And these details sink down into his subconscious, waiting and ripening, until one day they bubble up. Colm sits down at his desk and another novel is born. His most recent book is a sequel to the highly acclaimed and much-loved Brooklyn. It's called Long Island. Hi, Colm.
Hi, how are you?
Did a circus ever come to Enniscorthy?
Yes, and it was very, and I would have ended up as a clown, of course, or as a bad trapeze artist, or as the Saw the Woman in Half team, I mean, yes, it did, and when I'm talking about anything like that came, or if there was any possibility of going anywhere, if I could, watching carefully to see if some aunt might be going to Wexford for the day, can I go with you? All that sort of stuff. And they're still like that.
What were the big events on the calendar in your hometown?
I suppose, obviously Christmas, but my father was a teacher, and that meant we had longer holidays than everybody else. And they had some connection to a man who owned a little house on the Wexford coast. Now, it's only 12 miles away, but you should see how the family got together to bring 5 children and in a little Morris Minor that barely went on dirt roads to get there, because of course the road from the village to the coast was a dirt road, and that meant of course the beaches were empty, but they were empty for good reason. They were empty because it rained a lot in the summer. What would you be doing on a beach?
Did you swim when you were there?
Look, it was a nightmare. My mother was very athletic, and she had no patience with children who wouldn't get into the sea, and the sea was cold. So if you went down in the morning, with carry-cots, transistors, babies, aunties, a rug, the first rule was no children near the rug, children playing the sand, and then there would be a moment my mother would stand up and regally march down towards the sea and simply get in without stopping and swim out. She'd come back in and then announce that everyone else was to do the same. She'd just done. And so as a result, we would stand, my sisters, my brothers, we would stand up to our knees and jump as every wave came in. And the rule was no splashing, because obviously it would be the most evil thing to do with the cold Irish Sea, to splash. And you'd never be, the revenge would be tribal, if you splash. So we're all standing there. My mother said, stop this nonsense, get in, everybody. And you wouldn't. Eventually you might. And you think it's unimaginable that I would be fully immersed in this cold water. And once you get down into it, of course, it's fine. And someone told me, I didn't remember this, it's in every novel. That experience of standing in cold water about to get it etched itself into my soul.
What were Irish boys' swimsuits like when you were a kid?
Little togs. Well, we called togs, and I think you might call togs here. But in no other country, they're called swimsuits, bathing suits. But get into your togs or togging out. You'd say to someone in an almost mocking way, did you bring your togs? Meaning, we're all going into the sea, and so are you. Bring your togs.
Your characters are always getting dressed on the beach into their togs. It's a mark of sophistication if someone's learnt to put their togs on before leaving the house.
Yeah, but you see, in Spain, you could do that. When I went to Spain and saw this, it was unimaginable because, of course, your togs would dry. Once you came out of the sea, just 10 minutes later, they're dry. In Ireland, they'll be even more wet with the humidity. But yeah, the business of, if you're a boy, of putting a towel around you and trying to take down your trousers or your underpants and keeping your modesty preserved, and then trying to wriggle enough to get the togs on. That was an essential part of those summers. I mean, really, and honestly, the amount of work you put into that.
It's Irish yoga, I guess. When you'd have those family summers by the sea, were you still going to mass every week? Was faith and the traditions of faith a big part of your family?
It's funny you asked that. We never did the rosary or any of that stuff in the summer. My mother would try it in the winter, but there was always a problem that my father would start laughing. We'd all be kneeling, you know, my mother would sing, "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee, blessed." And my father was shaking. With you know, the solemnity of the room. He just couldn't handle the sort. But we would go to mass, but there was never benediction. There wasn't, in the summer they just didn't bother. Especially, the locals down there called us the bathers. Oh, there are plenty of bathers this year. Oh, there are bathers coming. And so bathers just went to mass on a Sunday into the village. And the main thing with your kid about mass is that you're promised ice cream afterwards. And it's very exciting.
Sweetens the deal.
Yeah.
In my experience, Colm, Catholics can be very devout and at the same time highly critical, particularly women Catholics. Was your mother like that?
Absolutely like that, where she could say, that sermon was too long. Or, I don't believe in limbo. Or that Father Murphy, what he said to me in confession, she went to a priest called Father Murphy. He was a cranky old fellow, and she just couldn't think of any sins, so she said she'd forgotten to say her night prayers. And he said, "Are you a mother?" And my mother said she was. And he said, "A nice mother." Well, she got years out of that Father Murphy, what a disgrace he was. What did he know about being a mother? He was obviously fed up hearing confession, and he thought he should insult someone. And he picked on her. He picked on the wrong woman. I mean, you're absolutely right that there was an anti-clericalism that had been there in Ireland since the 19th century. I think we might have sent it over here, a feeling that priest is fine in his own way. If we need him, we'll call him. For if someone's dying, or someone wants to get married. But in the meantime, people could say something about him. You just see him driving around in his car. I mean, just something like that.
What about writing? What value did that have in your family? What do you remember as a little kid?
It was huge. My father wrote articles on history for the local paper. When he was a student, and even later, he had done a lot of research in the National Library and in the British Museum on the history of the town since, I suppose, earliest times. So he had these big notebooks that he could use any time, filled with information, with quotes, with statistics. For example, there was a flood, and the bridge in the town, the old bridge, which would be, I suppose, a 17th century, 18th century bridge, nearly, was blown away in the floods. And my father wrote an article which appeared the following week in the newspaper called "A Strong, Brave Bridge." Now, I really remember this. And it was a detailed article, the first mention of the bridge when it was built, every other thing about it. And my mother had published poetry before she married. And one of the poems had been taken up and printed in a national newspaper with her name. And this, of course, was a famous poem in our house. It had been cut out. Recently I found it in the back of an anthology. She had pasted it in. And then my father had a brother who died young. He died of tuberculosis, and he had written poems in Irish. And so, it was always there, that idea that if there was any brush with, fame, it was a local fame. If there was any brush with that in the house, it wasn't for being rich or for becoming doctors, or was that funny business.
Did that spill over to the way people spoke? Like, were your family great storytellers in speaking? Was it something about writing it down, the written word?
You see, the storytelling wouldn't be, ancient Irish sagas. It would be my Auntie Harriet would arrive, and she'd been in Dublin, and she'd been nearly bought a coat.
Bought a coat.
And she'd be so filled with the coat and the buttons, and my mother would then go on about, Harriet, I don't think green suits you. And there'd be a silence. So it wouldn't be, in ancient times in Ireland there was a warrior. I mean, it would never be that. It would be so close to discussing the town, or did you hear about so-and-so? And then on my father's side, my uncle was a journalist on the local paper. So there was nothing he didn't know. And often what was important was what they didn't say. There were things my uncle would see in the court or hear in the court you'd know he wouldn't ever mention. And he knew things, my uncle, as did my father, about the Civil War, meaning 1922-23, which is a very bitter time where, after independence, suddenly the actual people who fought for independence fought each other over some very small set of principles. But my family was involved in that. And you see, in the town, they knew who killed who, and no one else knew.
And did they talk about that?
Never. And my father told my sister once that he knew, thought he was the only person who knew who had killed so-and-so in 1923 because a man had told him. Because a man was old, said, if someone needs to know this, I'm giving it to you. But my father said, I will never tell anyone, so it won't be known.
It seems, when you describe it like that, Colm, almost inevitable that you would become a novelist, that form that lets you be inside people's head and see that contrast between what they're thinking, what they know, and what they say out loud to other people.
Yeah, I've recently been working, I mean, like every writer eventually ends up writing about the Beatles at some point, but I've been doing research on George Harrison and Fourth in the Family. And that means he gets the music of the older generation, that even when he's 7, he's listening to the music of a 17-year-old because his older brother is 17. And you get that in other ways too, in the sort of freedom you win in the family to be in the room when certain things are being discussed. In the way the eldest is treated like a baby when the eldest is a baby. But if you're fourth, you really, you can see if you could just muscle in on what the others are doing or hearing. So I think fourth in the family is a very, very good recipe for anything, really.
You were fourth in the family, and you and number 5 were sent off to the country when you were 8 or so. Did you know why?
You see, I suppose because we were the 2 youngest, everyone left us alone. I mean, even though he was 4 and I was 8, we would decide our own bedtimes, and there was nothing. No one ever bossed us or told us what to do, or we could do anything. And then my father got sick. He got a brain problem. It was a problem in his brain, so it was sort of serious and involved a lot of preparation for a huge brain operation. This is 1963. I don't think you can imagine what brain surgery was like in 1963, but it wasn't very sophisticated. And it was very sudden. In other words, he finally, like a lot of men of that generation, he wouldn't go to a doctor. He just didn't like the idea of it. Women went to doctors because they had children. But why would men go to a doctor? But eventually there was a doctor from the other political party. But he respected him and liked him. And he turned up in that doctor's waiting room out of the blue. The doctor looked at him and brought him in immediately. Did whatever he did with the stethoscope and just got him into the car immediately and drove him to one of the big hospitals in Dublin. And not an ambulance, just drove him. And my mother made a decision that she would stay with him in Dublin. Wherever he was miserable, and she would stay in Dublin. And therefore we were left at home. The aunts looked after us. But by the end of, myself and my younger brother, obviously, it couldn't go on for long. And so it was decided that we would go to stay with another aunt. And she had 2 very young children. One was 1 and one was 3. And the last thing she needed was the 2 of us. Because we really behaved like, we were like 2 little, what was it called? An old man cut short. And we didn't know. I mean, people just didn't talk to children, about anything that was a problem. Our father was sick and he was in Dublin. My mother was with him, but we didn't know when it was going to end. And, it went on for a long time. It affected both of us badly.
You'd only just learned to read at that point. And you used to read the newspaper.
Barely read, but they got a newspaper called the Irish Independent. And that newspaper has a page of death notices. Maybe just more people died then or something. But it had a page of death notices, which would give you the name of the person and in brackets where they were from. And people would really read this. And I found it. I'd never noticed it before. But that was every day when the paper would come in, I would go through them to see if anyone in Enniscorthy had died. Now, I didn't connect this with my father. It wasn't an obvious connection. I didn't remember it until recently that I did that. What a strange thing.
You and your little brother, both there in a kind of exile. Did it make a close bond between the 2 of you at that time?
In certain ways, yes, but in obvious ways, no. When I look at the stuff that's going on, say, between Prince Harry and Prince William, it's out of a textbook that if you have trauma like that, the 2 brothers found it very difficult to show love for each other. But, we never fell out, but we never, ever talked about it.
Even as adults?
No. And one day, because they were doing roadworks, and to get from Dublin to Enniscorthy, the 2 of us on a Sunday, just to go down and have lunch with my mother, we're driving together, just the 2 of us, and we end up passing the very house where we're in. And I'm not going to speak about it. And he's not going to speak about it. And we're both in our 30s or early 40s. And we just let it go. We just don't want to go there. We don't know what to say. All those years later.
When you were brought back to the family home in Enniscorthy, where your dad was in sort of convalescing for a period, what was different about you, Colm? How had you changed?
I never trusted anything again, I don't think.
How did that show up in the way you communicated?
I developed a stammer, which was really a problem. I mean, there was a fellow who used to follow me home from school going after me. I've done a lot of work, not with a speech therapist, but actually myself with breathing and just how to handle it. But there's a huge problem with my name because it has 2 hard syllables. And every stammerer has a different way of stammering, but 2 hard... I mean, they're the big ones. Oh, I tell you, the big one was the family rosary. And you see, it comes to your turn and you have to give out the mysteries. And Our Father is lovely. Our Father, I mean, God wrote Our Father. Our Father, it's so easy to say, Our Father. Hail Mary is equally lovely. Hail Mary, but you can't say glory. And the whole family would wait, and I mean, and you suddenly turn, like you just, every part of you that controls the world you can speak. You say hello, hi, you say, you can't say glory. And I don't know who wrote that prayer, glory be, but it wasn't for stammerers. And I had to work my way out of it. And at one stage, I'm not making this up, but I had the same speech therapist as my father because my father's speech had been impaired by his operation. So I didn't know why they were bringing me in this woman, and this woman was looking at me and getting me to say things. And of course, sometimes if I was confident, I wouldn't have it. So she said to them, her diagnosis, I mean, doctors, her speech therapist, her diagnosis was, no, he doesn't have a stutter. He has a clutter.
A clutter?
That meaning that I was trying to say too many things too quickly. But I didn't have a clutter. There's no such thing as a clutter. I mean, it's like making up a new word for heart disease that's saying, a clutter. And my mother said, no, you see, you don't have a stutter. You have a clutter. That's what she said. Well, I mean, could these speech therapists get sense?
Your dad never fully recovered his health and he died when you were just 12, Colm. What was the atmosphere like at home after that? How do you remember it?
I mean, what you do then is you use silence very productively. In other words, really, we didn't mention it again, ever, I think. And this was begun by, within a few days of his death, the house would fill every evening. It's a small house, just semi-detached, local authority built house, and every evening people would call. Whatever way the room worked, it's a tiny room. It was filled with people, and people would talk. They would come in and say to my mother, I'm sorry for your trouble, I'm so sorry to hear you, it's the worst thing. And then they would never mention it again in their visit. They would discuss the whole day, and often it would be the better the news, some story would be told, but again, it would be about something local or recent. And that went on between July and Christmas. And I suppose I'm 12, my job is to answer the door and bring the person in and make sure that but by September of that year, 1967, the other siblings have gone to their various places, to school, to universities. And it's myself and my younger brother and my mother, just the 3 of us in the house. And, eventually it seems perfectly normal. In retrospect, it was very difficult. And she went back to work where she'd worked before she was married. And that was very difficult for her because she loved not working. She said that all the feminists were absolutely right about everything except women. The idea of having to leave your job and go home and never have to leave your house again was the most wonderful thing. She was, this is an amazing idea. It's a few years before the adding machine came fully into Ireland and they used clever women as their adding machines. And my mother's job, she could do these words have died out. She could do a perfect tot, meaning a huge ledger with infinite numbers, and she could add it up and have it perfect. And there was a man called Mr. Brearley, and he must have been in charge of taxes for the government, and he would come and redo her tots. And every time he'd just say, I don't know how you do it, you never make a mistake. And she'd come home and tell us, I never make... And there's another thing called the tote, which was in greyhound racing. You have to do a lot of complicated multiple division to get the number of people who have bet, to get the betting rate. And again, no machines. My mother could do that perfectly in 2 minutes so that it would be perfectly up. And she would go to the Greyhound track on a Thursday, and a number of women would too, often widows. And they would be paid, a small amount of money, but they would be able to. I mean, in later years, these people became surgeons, prime ministers, and took over the country in various ways. But these are the times when, my mother left school at 14. But this was an immense pride for certain women. She can do a perfect tot. And, the men somehow would be thinking about grander things and they'd be distracted, but the women would be completely concentrated on making sure that 7 and 9 were 16.
Did you inherit that skill?
In school, during my stammering years, I could really do nothing else much. You're multiplying complex numbers, multiply 217 by 49. And there was another boy in the class with a speech impediment as well. And both of us with our hand up way before anybody else. Yeah, I could do that. But I was never good at maths or anything, but I could do that.
You fell in love with poetry as a 12, 13-year-old. Was it something about the way language is used in poetry that was seductive for someone with a speech impediment? I'm just thinking, was it stuff that you'd read out loud, the first poets you fell in love with, or what was it? What grabbed you?
Besides the totting business, my mother, read a lot of poetry, and she'd say lines of poetry out of the blue for no reason, to the irritation of some people. But I was going in a train from London to the Cheltenham Festival, and I was with Sebastian Barry, and we were just going off on a Saturday morning to do a reading out of Paddington Station. So I said, Sebastian, I realised that he had a laptop, and I said, could you just Google something for me? Because a line of poetry that she had said came into my mind, I don't know why. And the line was, and that is how the big things pass and the little things remain, like the smell of the wattle in Lichtenberg riding in the rain. I could just, what's that from? Now, it's Kipling's version of an Australian soldier in South Africa in one of those wars that he's speaking. And he's describing going into a place called Lichtenberg in South Africa. But it's Kipling's imagining all the soldiers of the colonies, and that must be why the big things pass, and the little things remain, like the smell of the wattle in Lichtenberg riding in the rain. Now I don't know why that riding in the rain. I don't know why those lines are so affecting, and Kipling's not fashionable. Anyway, so Sebastian looked at it and said, "That's and he thought if you could just have that as a novelist, it'd be enough to go on with, just keep writing novels around that." But I'm talking about the sound of words, which for a lot of people of my generation came with pop songs, came with the Bob Dylan line, must have been mad, I never knew what I had, threw it all away. Those words would come in and would mean something much more. And sometimes you found it difficult to imagine other people weren't getting the same thing from the song as you were. And I'm just a poor boy, though my story's seldom told, And so age 12, in some way or other, in that time I'm talking about, I would go into the front room called the parlour, the room that no one was ever allowed to use. And I was allowed to study in there. And I suppose I was trying to study, but I was also every evening now, from that age onwards, writing poetry. And it rhymed sometimes, and then I found free, much to my delight, free verse, where you didn't have to rhyme, you didn't have to worry about rhyme words. And so that's how that started, and it didn't tell anyone for ages. And then I found a magazine that published teenage poetry, and I sent them stuff, and they began to print stuff. And then my uncle found stuff in the magazine and came up and said, "Was that you?" And I said, "Yeah, that's me." And there we go.
It's been happening ever since.
Yes.
Did you have teachers who encouraged you in that?
In the first school, the Christian Brothers, would have been the opposite. It would have been considered just a laugh. It would have been mocked, I think. But I went for the last 2 years to a diocesan boarding school. But there were two people there, an English teacher and a Latin teacher, who just simply looked after me. I mean, no matter what I was writing, I would give to them, and they would give me feedback, and they were incredibly nice to me. And I was it was mainly farmers' sons who were going to be farmers, and me, and they made that very easy for me. And even a few years later, when I'd left the school, the Latin teacher, Mr. Power, stopped me somewhere and said, "If you're not following up on that, you're going to be really sorry later on." And you're going to find like real frustration, like, are you working every day? And it was very nice of him to say that. But what happened was the poetry was awful. And by the time I went to university, it was worse. And a lot of my fellow students were writing good poetry. And Ireland got a lot of good poets. And there were a lot of better ones coming up. So I had to stop.
It's unfair competition that you have as an Irishman. You got to find another country and write poetry, and you'd be ahead of the pack.
Yeah.
As a little boy, you were saying even just going to Wexford to go to the shops was an exciting adventure, let alone the summer by the beach. So when you were old enough to have finished school and set off to university in Dublin, was this a chance to remake yourself the way that so many adolescents take that chance of first moving away from home and entering university? Was it a new Colm who appeared in Dublin?
Yeah, I grew a beard immediately. We rented a house, 6 people. I'm 17 years old. I found everything I studied fascinating. I found friends, and I found alcohol was great, just drinking if you could, it was the money. But reading and reading poetry, yeah, and it was total excitement. It was absolutely brilliant.
Where did you get the idea to go to Barcelona after finishing your degree?
The problem then in Ireland in 1975 was that the civil service was expanding because Ireland had joined the EU, so that you could very easily move into. They really wanted graduates to come in and work in the Department of Education and Health and all that, and you could see that so clearly. And I had 2 friends who had been in Barcelona come back to the university to do postgraduate work, and they seemed so glamorous. They had, they just lived in a different way. They, for example, would paint a room completely white, whereas I wouldn't know what to do with a room. And they would have ceramic, and they would have their dinner in a different way. I just thought this was great. And someone said to me, that you could always get work in Barcelona, that they knew the guy who ran the school called the Dublin School of English, and that it was a good school in that it paid teachers well. You didn't need any qualifications. So I just immediately, when it was said to me, I said, I'm going to do that.
So, Colm, you had this idea to go off to Barcelona after finishing university in Dublin. What did your mother think about this?
Well, I just told her I'd been offered a really good job in Barcelona. And the word really good job rang really mattered in the town. I hadn't got a job at all, but I was told I would get work. And so I finished my exams, I got my degree, and the day after I finished the exams, I went on a cheap student flight to Barcelona, and it was good. It was good, yeah.
Not long after you arrived, Franco died. It must have been an amazing time to be in the country.
You see, it was even more amazing because Northern Ireland had become so intractable that the troubles which had begun with civil rights marches had now moved into a sort of tribal warfare with the British Army involved. In a most unhelpful way, I have to say. And the IRA really building up this great thing about nationalism and we need to fight for Ireland. And it just looked as though it would never end. And indeed it didn't. I mean, it went on for 20 more years. And in Spain, it looked as though the same thing was going to happen. They were going to refight their civil war. And so Franco died, and the forces are all there. There are communists, there are nationalists, and there are fascists. And, well, what happens in that melting pot? It boils. And that isn't what happened. That the king turned out to be this very wise figure. And he appointed a prime minister who was a total fascist, who turned out not to be a total fascist, Suarez. And he was a great hero because the two of them together, when the king went to say, what should we do? Suarez said, now, bring in democracy and elections now. And watching the marches, which were sort of unnecessary marches, and they were going to give us anyway what we wanted. But everyone was so young and so beautiful. Summer was coming. Franco dies in November. By April, the marches are big. They're for nationalists. They're for Catalan independence. They're for the release of prisoners. They're for amnesty. They're for freedom. And it just looked, you have no idea what it looked like. It was the most beautiful time to be alive.
Spain was having its liberation moment.
Yeah.
What about Colm?
I'm having a whale of a time. Now, you see, there are no gay bars. One thing fascists love is just repressing anyone who, they just love so gay people are always in the front row of who to repress. And I mean, if you want to judge a society, just look at how many gay bars there are in a city or something. There were no gay bars in Barcelona. It meant that there were certain streets that were just wild at night. And you think that people were just walking up and down the street. No, they weren't. And you think that people were just, looking into a window of a shop. No, they weren't. And so this thing which was later called cruising, or in America probably even then, no one knew what it was called, but it was a very exciting time. It was before AIDS, it was before heroin, before a big heroin epidemic, it was before HIV epidemic. So I'm talking 1976, 77. And it was sort of innocent time, and so I was having a really good time. I was being really well paid. I had my own flat. I was going to a lot of concerts. I was seeing a lot of the great singers. I was going to the opera. I don't know how the day got filled like that. Doing a lot of drinking and having a lot of sex, and it was just excellent.
Well, why on earth did you leave this hedonistic paradise to return to Ireland?
One of the problems was that you couldn't vote, and you realised that no matter whatever happens, you will be an outsider here. And especially Catalan society is so family-led, and the bonds that are made at university and through summer holidays and people having houses near each other, you're always going to be outside that. And while you're being well paid, you're never going to be better paid. It's hard in English language teaching to move up a notch. You go to university and you see that the next 20 years is going to be in some way or other possibilities of promotion or just getting a more interesting job, and that wasn't going to be available. And I had a boss who said to me, "Don't stick it out here because you're drinking too much already, and you're 22 or 23." And so I went home.
Did you already have the dream of being a writer at that point?
No, because I didn't. I thought writing fiction was ridiculous. Filling in all the gaps, saying, you have to say, well, if it's March in one chapter, it has to be April in the next, because obviously like all that stuff. I was a failed poet, and I was prepared to go on being a failed poet, but I didn't. The idea of that whole verisimilitude and chapter 2 and stuff.
So how did that change?
Slowly, I went home, and within a year I had an idea for a novel. And I tried to write short stories. I couldn't work them at all. It was like a clutter where I would try and put all the information in the first paragraph as to who everyone was and where they had been, who their mother had been, had been. And what you learn in fiction is if you can't say it, don't write it. And I worked with an editor for a while, and she would often just say "see over," and the other side of the page would be, "Try saying that sentence out loud." And I realized it's unsayable. Sometimes you get a clunky sentence, and it is clunky if you say it, with too many did. And eventually I got an idea for a novel. And also I started to work as a journalist.
It must have been a huge culture shock to come back from that time in Spain, and that freedom for you personally to come back from, I imagine, a much more conservative Ireland in the 70s.
Young people won't believe it. For example, Dublin didn't have central heating, except in really posh houses that had oil fires.
I think you're going to talk about like gay life or sort of... No, you're talking about central heating.
No,
was that
desperate? See, the central heating is vital because if you're in a pub and it's 9 o'clock and you have a choice of going home to a damp flat, it's only rising damp, with no heating, and it's November, or staying in the pub, well, you just kind of stay. One of the reasons why there was so much drinking was the alternative was home, and home was freezing. And you sheets, getting into sheets, you realise the sheets are damp. And there are a lot of cheap flats in Dublin for really good reasons. They're all gone now, of course. Really good reasons because they're so damp. The other thing was that reform in the Republic came really slow. For example, contraception was just banned. And the effort to reform it was 1979. So I'm 1 year back from Barcelona, where you could, if you went to a doctor and told the doctor you needed condoms for family planning purposes and you were married, he could write you a prescription, and you would bring that to a chemist shop and hand it. Well, I had the best time because I realized this was so open to mockery. So I did it for about a year for a magazine or a newspaper. Every so often I would go to 6 doctors and tell them my story, like that I was myself and my wife. I would arrange beforehand what to say to each of them. But with one of them, I would always say, no, I just want to get my rocks off the weekend. And I just might have sex, but I don't know who with who. And there was a woman saying, "Get out of here." The doctor, "Get out of here, you mean?" I said, "Well, what am I meant to do? Like, what would you do?" I said, "I don't want to listen to you." And she attacked me for my immorality. And then there was a wonderful moment in Cork where I arrived with a prescription. Now, this time I had a press photographer behind me who's hiding his camera to take a photograph of the poor young girl. And she looked at the thing for 20 packets of condoms from a doctor. And she went back into the back room And this very, let's say, bossy or a very formidable pharmacist woman came out and looked at me and said, "What is it you want? We don't stock. I'm very sorry to tell you. I don't know what you've come in here for." And this was the law. This was under the law. It was a great country sometimes. It was a place to make fun of. And there was a prime minister who was tremendously pompous. You've had some of them here too, who could just say the Irish people will not tolerate sudden change, And you could just spend your time laughing at him and making fun of him and going to press conferences asking him a really stupid question,
Actually, just when you describe yourself in those press conferences, Colm, I think about you saying you would have been the clown rather than the ringmaster or the lion tamer. I guess you took on that kind of role to a degree. Did you get pushback from readers or other people?
No, it was the opposite. Everyone. The society had moved so far ahead of the church and of the politicians. But, of course, there's always a group in every country of right-wing people who have nothing else to do and plenty of money and can become a lobby group of immense importance. The anti-abortion group, the anti-divorce group. I mean, we had these people. We've seen them all. But, God, did it take time. I mean, Ireland did change. The aim, I suppose, was to get the church out of our hair, even though I was going bald at the time, and to get the politicians to stop listening to the bishops. There was a need for huge areas of reform, such as getting in gas central heating, for example. And also in Northern Ireland, just to get, if you're a Catholic from Southern Ireland, what you need to do is to say, "Not in my name." The car bomb was not in my name. And that the nationalism you're talking about, this idea of the Ireland as a spiritual place, as a place that was made one because God made it one, forgetting geology, and the fact that England was meant to be a 700-year enemy. All of us who'd gone to England had been made very welcome there. I mean, it was a fun place to go, was London. So all this killing Protestants, why would you want, this has to stop. And so, I mean, that was, I suppose, the aim was to see if you could just get Southern Ireland as a bloc. And what happened, oddly enough, was the British government discovered that the Irish government wanted the same thing as they wanted, which was stability in Northern Ireland and an end to the killing. And there was a lot of negotiation, but it took much longer than Spain. But again, it was an interesting example of how politics can actually work at certain moments.
In this time as a reporter, you went to the Sudan. What story were you covering there?
There was a famine in Ethiopia and in the north of Sudan. Huge numbers of refugees had come over the border and huge numbers of Irish NGOs had gone there. And my brother was among them. And so I went there as a reporter. The Sudanese government particularly wanted these refugees not to stay. So they wanted absolutely impermanence, meaning that even the tents themselves would have to be pretty flimsy. So there was a lot of politics. There was also a lot of politics about American aid. And I even asked a man who was in charge of American aid in Sudan at that time, everyone's saying you're holding back aid because the politics of the Sudan doesn't suit you. And he said, "Yeah, that's exactly right. That's what we're doing." But that's wrong. That business of the convoys are there, the borders are closed, playing politics with people who are starving. And I think you know what I'm talking about now. But watching it then where he frankly and openly said, yeah. And, darkness fell around 5, meaning after 5 you could not go out. And the only excitement possible was the BBC World Service, which would come and go. In other words, on the air, somehow or other, in the transistor would, and it would stop. And then suddenly the news would come. And honestly, it would go, the BBC, they never got any sense. It would play the music first, which was a very offensive colonial tune. And then it would go, "This is the world news." And then at the very end, they'd say, "This is the end of the world news." The end of the world news. Honestly, they said that. And what they would tell you, and you're in the middle of a famine, you're in the middle of a really repressive society, there's a curfew, and they would say, as the first item on the world news, "Mrs. Thatcher has had a further meeting with Mr. Heseltine." And you go, I think I know that the world is still, the old order is still there. And but then they would love, the thing they would love doing most is, "This is the world news. There has been a coup in Zanzibar. The police have the city sealed off." You go like, where are we? The police have the city sealed off. And the number of cities got sealed off during the period was high.
Your younger brother Niall, who you were staying with in the Sudan and with whom you'd had this pivotal early experience of being sent off to live with your aunt while your father was in hospital in Dublin. Niall died from kidney disease in 2004. You'd shared so many intense experiences together, Colm. When you came to write about your childhood in novelistic form in Nora Webster, were you conscious of what he would think of the story? Was he in your mind as a presence as you wrote that book?
He was quite sardonic, so that he would say, God, you're not, like, could you write about, like you've been all over the world. Like here you are, like you're trying to go back to this house. Could you get over it? Just get over it. Get over it. So it wasn't as though I felt him as a sort of guardian angel. But in the same few years, he died and my mother died. So that house, which was a very intense time, especially in retrospect, thinking about it, it stayed with us, the three of us there in that house. And my father dead, and none of us really knowing what to do. So when my father died, he was 8 and I'm 12. My mother's 40, mid-40s. And so it's not a dedication in the book. It's just I put their names with not for or in memory of, just their names and their dates, meaning there were three of us. And I'm the one who's alive. But the novel, Nora Webster, is the story of what happened to us. And it's told from my mother's perspective. Partly because it's very hard to get enough sensibility for a 12-year-old. And I was watching her so carefully. And so I made up some things, but most of it is actually what happened.
There's a very moving, strange sequence in that novel where Nora, the mother, encounters ghosts. Were you surprised when you wrote that?
It's the hardest thing to do in a novel that deals with secular life. The novel is a secular space. It loves money. It loves choices, chances. It loves the love leading to marriage. It doesn't let the devil is not a good person in a novel. That's not the way a novel works. And is it possible I can manage this at the end of the book? So the first thing you have to do is make it credible that she's not sleeping. She put up wallpaper. I don't know if you've ever done that. It's a lot of armed, like really, and painting a ceiling. If you're, she's not used to it. So she gets these pains and she can't sleep. She can't sleep and she can't sleep. And so you realize she's in this sort of strange mood. And but I have to write this. So I have a house now where we went in the summers. I built my own house there. I have to say my siblings just, why would you?
Of all the places in the world.
Go to Marbella, go to the Canary Islands, for God's sake. And so I go there and I know I have to write this. And I know that I won't be able to write it twice. If it doesn't work, it will never work. So the rule is to get up at 5 a.m, to go to bed really early, to be on your own in the house, get up really early, and have the things near you that you might need. Hamlet, for example, just so to see exactly what the ghost says. T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets, Little Gidding, where he sees a ghost in bombed-out London. And the Milton poem where he sees his wife. Methought I saw my late wife. And then the music, because it's where she puts on Beethoven's Archduke Trio, which is what my mother would have put on. So this is not a novel, this is me. And it's not even autobiography. I'm conjuring. I'm trying to move very close in to put the music on. And if the music somehow will give me. Now, I don't play the music when I'm actually writing, but I put it on just before. I have the other things on the table. And I know when all this is over, I'm going to go for the longest swim. If I could, this is going to take me 3 or 4 hours. So maybe it'll be midday. And I don't care what it's like. It was raining. It was raining, of course. I'm going into the water for as long as I can when this is over. And I wrote down the account that my father, that she goes up, she hears a noise and she goes upstairs and she sees him. They had a little rocking chair in the bedroom. And, well, there he is. And I want the reader to feel this is actually, she's hallucinating. But also it's very close for her. And I wrote that, and I didn't change it afterwards, except for some words, just to make it more, maybe move quicker or something. But It was a very intense experience, and it certainly, when the book was finished, it was published at my request the day after eligibility for the Booker Prize. Meaning I didn't like the idea that I would be in London wearing a monkey suit, would it win or not? Or would I go up and make a speech? Like, I just didn't want any of that near the book. I don't want any of that idea of this is an element of commerciality or anything in this book. I mean, I was paid for it, obviously, but it was a pretty important thing for me to do. And every so often someone reads it who has been through the experience or knows something about it. And so there's a funny little connection it makes with people, because what I tried to do was to make it as particular and exact and as close to the detailed truth as I could manage. So it's not as though I'm trying to be universal. I'm not. I'm trying to be exact and particular and using as much memory as I can.
This most recent book, Long Island, started with an image for you too. Tell me what that was.
I was reading Thomas Hardy's Mayor of Casterbridge, which is a very exciting opening where a man puts his wife up for sale. And someone buys her, 1830s. And the rest of the novel is, the result of that. So I just had an idea, because the 20 years after Brooklyn, Eilish has a very peaceful domestic life. It's a sort of, I suppose it's what happiness is called, or ordinariness. And, she gets married, she goes to live in a house in the suburbs, she has 2 kids. And I can't really write that.
There aren't many novels of happiness.
No. And so you need a disruption. You need something to break the pattern. And so I thought of the most disruptive thing I could think of. And once I thought of it, I thought, that's melodrama. Tony, her husband, who's a plumber, was in a house. He had sex with the woman of the house, who was obviously not having a sexual relationship with her husband anymore. And so her husband realizes when she's pregnant, there's only one person this can be, the plumber. Now, that's ludicrous. I mean, that's just think of serious novelists. I mean, let's name some. Do you think that David Malouf would write that? Do you think that, Salman Rushdie
George
would write
Eliot
that?
wouldn't write it.
Do you think that George Eliot would touch it? Do you think that Helen Garner, like no matter who you think of,
Helen Garner might actually.
Yeah, actually, that's possible. but luckily, the pandemic was on. And it was a time when if you didn't write whatever was on your mind, your days would be unhappy. There's no point in strategizing. If something has come into your mind like that, as that an Irishman comes to her door and he's married to the woman, he's got a big Irish accent and he shouts at her, "Your husband." And if I ever see him again, I have an iron bar waiting for him. But when the baby is born, if you think I'm having that baby in my house with my children who were conceived decently, now I'm leaving the baby up to you. You see, he's Irish because she has to know how to read him. If he's American, it could just be blustering. She thinks he means it. She knows that sort of man. Now, what do you do with this once you've written it? And what I had to do with it was the next 8 pages are the quietest pages. It's almost as though you've been having a big symphony going on, big loud drums, and you suddenly get down to a solo cello, where Eilish is alone in the house, the man has gone, and I suppose in real time it would be 2 hours or an hour and a half. In the novel, it's about 7 pages. She has to be the quietest. She has to do nothing, not speak, not cry. She has to just be in the house alone. So I have to bring it down from the big garish melodrama at the opening into the quietest stuff I can get in order to rescue her character from melodrama and try and bring it somewhere close to what I might call, truth.
From Eilish's love life to your own, Colm, you live in LA much of the year with your partner. How did the two of you meet?
I was doing a reading in a bar in New York. It's an upstairs dive in the East Village called KGB. I was reading with a friend. She had met him, this guy, earlier in the day, who she'd known him before. Said, "Oh, I'm doing a reading later on. Why don't you come around? We'd have a drink after and stuff." And this guy came into the room, and it's that lovely. I mean, it happens to a lot of writers, but it's usually a sad story. Someone so beautiful came in that she said, "Whoever he or she is, I knew," but they turned out to be, married with 5 children, or straight when you were gay, or gay when you were straight. And so, and I didn't see him again for a year. But he was on my mind, and I found out about him. And seemingly the same thing happened the other way. And so that was a big game changer. I mean, I would recommend it to every writer. Just look carefully at the audience. You never know who's there.
You spend much of your time together in LA where he's based, which is, a city famed for its highways and cars. Do you get the chance to overhear people the way that you could overhear them in that sitting room or parlour in Enniscorthy?
No, I think that trying to write Australian speech, trying to write American speech, you would so get things wrong. Just little words that are so basic to the texture of things. I would even have trouble with an English voice, I think. And so therefore I'm locked into the Irish thing. I don't drive in LA. The freeways are dangerous because if you don't know how to cross 3 lanes to get off the freeway, which you often have to do, because when in Ireland, if you indicate on the very few freeways we have, the truck will let you in. Just presumed you've indicated, meaning you want to get in. Why not let you in? It doesn't make any difference. But honestly, in California, they don't do that. So you indicate, and the truck will get even more interested in holding that lane. So there's nothing you can do. You can't. There's no space ahead, and behind there's a car behind you. Is already beeping the horn, meaning you have to go faster. And honestly, you really want to know what you're doing on those freeways, and the best thing to do is not driving them at all. And then if you don't drive them at all, because there's no public transport, you can never go anywhere. And that's a marvellous thing, to be stranded as a novelist. And my partner drives, and so if he's going somewhere, I'll go with him. The usual going to the circus thing. But most days are spent in this house just working and wandering around, just going and sitting in the garden. And of course, it's like when Irish people come to Australia, they write home about, the gardens, the fruit, the way things grow. You have no idea the lemons in our garden, which in Ireland, of course, they'd be lucky to have an apple, a crab apple in your garden.
When you do go back to Ireland, to your house by the sea or to Wexford, do you ever catch a glimpse of a man who might have been you had you not left?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this. It's a novel I nearly started writing recently, but I don't know what I'll do with it, is that I would have taken that job in the civil service, that I would have not gone to Spain. And I maybe even not gone to university. I would just have gone straight, which I could have done at 17, into government, and what that might have been like. Try to imagine sort of an alternative existence as a novel, but I don't think about. I think self-consciousness in men, especially middle-aged to elderly men, thinking about the sort of life I might have lived, is intolerable. Imagine you go out for a drink with your friends, saying, "I was just thinking recently that I could have been. If I had been that, I could have been that, and then I've been that." I say, you are a bore. Why don't you shut up? You need to stop. So I would, think about it only for the purposes of writing. But you asked me, and I gave you an answer, but I should have not. I should have said, no, I never think about it.
I appreciate the answer, and you are the opposite of a bore, Colm.
No, well, you try me,
Colm Toibin, thank you so much for being my guest on Conversations.
Thank you.
Podcast, broadcast, and online. You're listening to Conversations with Sarah Konoski on ABC Radio. Hear more conversations anytime on the ABC Listen app or go to abc.net.au/conversations.
This conversation with Colm Toibin was produced by Maggie Morris and recorded on the lands of the Gadigal peoples. Our executive producer is Nicola Harrison. I'm Sarah Konoski. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Sarah Konoski. For more Conversations interviews, head to the website abc.net.au/conversations.